election earlier this year, the Malinauskas government, recognising the community concern about tree loss, committed to reverse the loss of green space and tree canopy across our suburbs by achieving Australian best practice for tree removal regulations and a targeted plan with Green Adelaide for new plantings so everyone benefits from access to green space near them. Tonight, to tell us more, is the man whose job it is to deliver on that commitment. The Honourable Nick Champion, MP, Minister for Trade and Investment, Minister for Housing and Urban Development, and the Minister for Planning. Please welcome Minister Champion.
Thanks, Sophie. Certainly like to begin by acknowledging Uncle Tamaru's very kind welcome and to acknowledge the Kaurna people and their elders past, present and emerging, to Craig Wilkins and to Joanna, to my parliamentary colleague, Jane Stinson, very passionate advocate for her local area and the grey box trees as well in that particular reserve, or what is now going to become a reserve. To Heather Holmes-Ross, I saw Heather, Mayor of Mitcham. I've been out to Mitcham and trees came up out there, certainly is a big issue. I'd also like to acknowledge Craig's very important, Conservation SA's very important previous reports, which did set the scene for this community campaign. It's good to see that there's so many passionate people here, I could hear the sort of trauma that was going on as people relived some of those events that perhaps have brought you all here today. Obviously, we've made an election commitment and we were elected to government, so we certainly intend to deliver on that commitment. And it's interesting in reflecting on some of the issues that have come up in my portfolio. Trees have been some of the most important early ones. The trees down on Frome Road, which was because of Lucy Hood's intervention. She rang my office, she talked me through it. I asked Renewal SA, who I happen to be Minister for. And the interesting thing about that is that they actually didn't need to remove them at all. It would have been a cost to Renewal SA to remove them, and it was really actually quite unnecessary. So it didn't actually, I don't want to present myself as something I'm not. It wasn't that hard an intervention. I just asked. And I think that perhaps, perhaps we need to reflect on that as a proviso. Perhaps we're not asking enough in the first instance. So I found that out as a minister. Obviously, as a Minister for Planning, one of my issues is housing affordability and planning, and my act, as Stefan reflected on, is part of that picture. So if we look at Adelaide's development, we started off with William Light, who designed the grid and the parklands that surround the city, which make us unique. Particularly there is a city, no other city like it in the world, and we know that continued. Adelaide's development pattern, if you like, was really to build on farms as we spread out. We just kept on building on farms. Sometimes we did it very well. There's a garden suburb of Colonel William Light, but if you go down to, if you go up to Elizabeth, where I was born, that was once a farm, and presumably prior to being a farm, it was country that had trees on it and native bushland. When my parents moved to Marion, we moved to one of the old farmhouses on Oliphant Avenue. There was an almond tree in the back garden. That almond tree's not there now. There's a house there. So we had this development pattern, I think, which allowed us to spread out along the plains. That had a cost to it, but it was basically small houses on big blocks, and often people planted trees, fruit trees and other trees, in their back gardens. We've now, since the advent of the 30-year plan, had a focus on infill because we didn't want to keep pushing out. And we protected areas in the south and areas in the north and the Barossa and the like with the environmental and food protection areas. So that's a good thing, but the pressure it put on infill, we saw some of those pictures there, which are, perhaps a better use of infrastructure and the like, but they have had a consequence for trees, I think, that was not perhaps processed when the first 30-year plans were coming out. And to give you an idea, 67% of our growth has been coming from urban infill. So it's a very big, notwithstanding we saw the effects of some of the greenfield expansion at Mount Barker and Gawler East as well. Density's been creating an issue for trees, and obviously greenfield growth creates an issue for trees. Perhaps the only area of densification that does not are very tall buildings, but we know that Adelaide, my first interview as planning minister, someone rang up and they said, I don't like greenfield, don't like outer suburban growth, I don't like infill, and I don't like tall buildings. It's a bit hard to know where to go after that. And it's important to acknowledge the drivers for these things are not always population growth, but the changes in the way people are living. So more of us living on our own and more of us living in more complex family arrangements, more diverse family arrangements, which have lowered the number of people per household. So we're trying to get at what is a very difficult balancing act between improving our tree laws and the 30-year plan, which is coming down the track at us, which will map out Adelaide's growth for the next 30 years. One of the things we promised at the election was an expert panel to look into the Planning, Development and Infrastructure Act and the Code, and they're currently undertaking that. Not despite Stephen saying, while they've said that they won't provide specific recommendations to me, they are the vehicle for us to examine the issue, and they're the vehicle by which I chose to release those reports, which were commissioned by the State Planning Commission. So what we've got at the moment is a fairly complex, a period of community consultation, community conversation, and a process, both the expert panel, and we're now currently doing the regional plans for the 30-year plan, and next year will be the plan for Greater Adelaide, and that is being funded so we can do it appropriately and think carefully about what might be our development pattern over the next 30 years. And that's an important piece of public policy work. It's the vehicle by which we've released the reports, and of course it's the vehicle by which all of you can make submissions and have your say. It won't, of course, be the end of the process, because inevitably when governments, I've seen these boomerangs come out with reviews or expert panels or the like, at the end of the day the work always returns to the minister, always returns to the government, and then you have to actually implement change, which is a very, very difficult thing. And Stephen sort of talked about that you have to convince the community and talk to the community and discuss these things with the community in order to have a deep sort of social licence to implement them. So that sort of outlines the process. I should sort of say that most of the advice coming back to me, the sort of anecdotal advice, is that our tree laws are underdone. Even developers have said that quite often it's kind of easier for them to clear a block or the like. And it's interesting, there are some strange sort of byproducts of all of this, believe it or not. I was down at a friend's place about would have been just after I was appointed as minister, and he had a nice frangipani it was in a pot, but it was quite big. And frangipanis take a long time to grow. They're a great tree. I said, oh, it's a lovely tree you got there. He goes, yeah, I bought it for $5,000. And he bought it off someone who is prospecting for these trees as developers take them out, and he then sells them. So there's an example, I suppose, of the economic value of a tree that had been taken out of a block, taken down to Port Adelaide, and then he had bought it. And it seems to be strange social phenomenon when that is occurring. So we want to make sure we hold to our election commitment. This process is part of that. The State Planning Commission's released some work, not just these reports, but a guide for plantings and new developments. It seems to me to be, a good thing that so many of you are here tonight, and I'm sure we'll have a really great question and answer session. It is a challenge, I think, to get the balance right, and it is going to be a challenge for government to get the balance right, because inevitably you do have infrastructure that has to go in, and that can often present sort of pretty agonising choices for policy makers, for decision makers. It isn't easy, and we have to make sure that when we do that, that it's done in an appropriate way, in a sensible way, and we've really looked at every option before we do things. So I'll let us get to the questions. Hopefully people will be cognisant of the fact that we're at a particular time and place in our state's history. We're trying to balance these competing demands on our development, and I look forward to you all participating, not just tonight, but in the expert panel and the 30-year plan. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Minister. Okay, so now we're going to have this Q&A session, and we're going to be using Slido. So again, please scan the QR code. Hopefully it will take you straight to the app and open it up on your phone, and then you have the ability to type in a question. If it doesn't, go straight to Slido and enter that code. Now, questions will come up on the screen in a minute, and I'm going to try and get through as many questions as we can. You can also upvote questions. So when you look at the questions, if you think that's the thing, rather than us having hundreds of different ones, if that's what you're passionate around, please make sure that you upvote them. Also in the audience tonight, we should point out that we've got two people able to answer specific questions. We've got Professor Chris Daniels, Chair of Green Adelaide, ABC Guru and Radio Star, and an expert on urban ecology. And we've also got Tom Morrison. Tom, do you want to stand up and just turn around so people can see you? Tom is the founder of the popular 20 Metre Tree Facebook page. Hear, hear. He's also lead author of many of the reports featured tonight and winner of the Mitcham Council Young Citizen of the Year Award and this year's Jill Hudson Award for Environmental Protection for his tree advocacy and policy work. Okay, so, oh, that's right there in front of me. Okay, awesome. Minister, do you want to stand up here? I'll let you pass that. We'll give you a microphone and we will let Chris and Tom interject if they think it's with respect when okay, so exemption for DIT be removed.
Well, I don't think so, is the long and the short of it. And I don't want to lead people into thinking that that exemptions will be removed particularly when I haven't discussed it with the Minister for Transport. But one of the things I have been discussing with my CE is writing to all the other government departments about tree removal and just reminding them that we are going into this process, the government does have this commitment, and we've got the 30-year plan which is part of the process of internally with government and talking about how departments interact with planning. So it is an issue for discussion, but I don't think the exemption will go, is the long and the short of it.
Not good enough. Not good enough.
Why will the review panel not be making recommendations about specific tree circumference, height or canopy spread?
Well, they've put out a discussion paper. Like I said, this is actually the work had begun on trees with the State Planning Commission. So they'd actually commissioned the report and they've been working on a body of work anyway for for new homes and dealing with this urban infill issue. It's not just trees, it's stormwater, parking, there's a range of other issues. So one of the things I've done through the expert panel, these reports were coming to me. I use the expert panel to put them out for public discussion. So that's one of the reasons you can read them all. And I did that quite deliberately because I wanted for all of you to be able to discuss it, and if you liked them, that was good, and if you wanted to give me a bit of feedback by hissing at me, or that's fine too, because it's important that we have those discussions. I appreciate people are not going to, this is the beginning of a process. I appreciate people are really passionate about it. And part of my job at this point is to listen. So,
If you had listened to tomorrow, you wouldn't be saying that you would not consider something.
Let's keep going. South Australia is the only state with a one-size-fits-all tree protections. This doesn't work or meet community expectations. How will the state government address this?
Well, we're the only state with a single code, so I think that's important. And the new code does actually have sort of somewhat better protections than in the previous Act. And you saw an example with a pool probably happened under the previous Act and previous arrangements. So, we're dealing with a single code, single planning system. We've got an e-planning system that has some challenges to it. But it also has some advantages as well in that, we can actually, if we deal with tree regulation, it'll be dealt with across the Adelaide area rather than kind of a hodgepodge of councils, which it is in the other states. So it's a feature of South Australia's planning system at the moment.
Now, I know there are arborists that are qualified in the room here tonight. And this is an interesting question. Why is there no regulation for arborists in South Australia?
I don't know, but I was shocked when I was talking to Stefan there about that. He also said that in a peculiar sort of arrangement, you can only get into an arborist course at TAFE if you work in the industry, which seems to me to be a bit of a kind of strange closed shop type of arrangement. So that's obviously an area we can look at. Obviously an area, it seems to me that most professions need to have qualifications, need to have some area of regulation around them. At the moment, we've got a bit of a shortage of planners and a whole range of other professions which are important to the state. And I'm in the process of talking to the universities about that. So this seems to me to be one more occupation on the list that perhaps has to be A, regulated, and B, has to have some work on the pathways into it, and then obviously into the professional application of it.
I might even ask if one of the professional arborists in the room would like to comment about that. Could we just let one of the arborists respond? Marcus, do you want to, or Ben?
There's no regulation of arborists nationally. There's a few organisations like Arboriculture Australia and the Institute of Australian Consulting Arborists that have qualified members lists, and that's probably the easiest and best way to try and find someone. Unfortunately, because both of those organisations are based on the Eastern Seaboard, they're not very well. They're not very attractive to local arborists. Let's put it that way. So there's not as many of us in there as probably there should be.
And in response to people who aren't able to do Slido, we have got a ream of questions coming in, but what we will try and do is leave some time towards the end to answer some that haven't been covered already. I think you may well find that some of the questions coming up will get covered. Okay.
I'll take them on notice too. If there are unanswered questions at the end of the night, you can always email me at the office and I'll attempt to get an answer back to Craig.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, can you commit to any specific regulatory changes as recommended by Uni Adelaide or CCSA?
Well, I'm not going to preempt reviews. So we've got the expert panel. We've got the 30-year, we've got the plan for Greater Adelaide, 30-year plan. So I won't be preempting those, and most importantly, I won't be preempting community consultation. So it's not just people in this room, it's people outside of it. Obviously, there's a range of people who will be interested in it, and they need to be able to provide their feedback.
Excuse me, could I respectfully ask the next speaker?
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Does that help?
I have great difficulty hearing what you're saying. Okay.
And bear in mind, many of us have been in rooms like this over the years. And so we're all passionate tonight about seeing change and not to be in another meeting in a couple of years down the track with the same feeling. Is the social licence for tree protection really that difficult to push when the climate crisis is at the forefront of so many voters' minds?
Look, never take the social licence for granted is the answer, because I was in the National Parliament in 2007. We were elected on a climate consensus, and within 3 years that had completely disappeared. And I was on the front line of that, if you like, running for election in both 2010 and 2013. And let me tell you, when that social licence broke down, it became almost impossible to get progress. So it was really, I wouldn't take it for granted. You actually do have to turn up to constant meetings. You do have to fight for these things. Absolutely.
We're the ones fighting for it. You're not. You're not taking it forward. Why are we here?
Well, I don't know if that's true. I've come here tonight at your invitation. I've listened to you. I'm endeavouring not to preempt the review, and this is the sort of the process by which you provide feedback.
Thank you, Sophie. Tom here has dobbed me in to say a few words about social licence, because it's really one of the vital roles for Green Adelaide, which means working with you around what does green space actually mean. And for us in Adelaide, one of the real problems that we face is that green means different things for different people, and we have done so many different things across the city that it's not a homogeneous structure. So you can think about Uncle Tamaroo and what he was saying about the landscape in 1836 was quite vastly different to what it looks like now, and was different in different regions. So the north, your old stomping ground was malleebox and grasslands. You move through the reed beds of the south, the open woodlands around the Hills Face Zone, grasslands, all these different sorts of environments. And they were largely completely cleared. So we actually had basically a completely destroyed landscape. There's only about 3% remnant vegetation left in Adelaide. And as Tom and Stefan have shown, this is vastly different to the cities elsewhere. Not the least also because we are a Mediterranean or a type of Mediterranean climate, whereas most of the other major cities are also either cold, temperate, high rainfall areas or subtropical or tropical cities like Brisbane and Sydney. So they had many more trees, and people recognised them and kept them, and they survived much of colonisation they didn't hear. So what we wind up then with is a whole mass of different types of green that are loved by different types of the community. And we don't really understand our green, so we don't really know what we should be doing. And this is probably the first big challenge. So the social licence for some communities, the eastern suburbs, for example, is very much around well-established big trees, but often, not particularly, but quite often they're introduced trees like oak and ash and elm, and we can wind up with a lot of those big ones, which can cause a number of other problems for the natives. Many of our actual trees, our original trees, are on the border of going extinct, as many of you know. So there is also that challenge about how we retain remnant vegetation. So the social licence varies a lot depending on where people are and what it particularly means. We've then got challenges around things like improving the canopy by 20%, and that was in the 30-year plan, as you well know. Well, what does that actually mean? I mean, you can improve by 20% really easily by increasing tree canopy at Port Adelaide or in the north, where in fact there's less than 10% tree canopy there, whilst at the same time chopping down the big old trees in the eastern suburbs or in some of those, the remnant suburbs. So we need to be very careful about what we mean on a different regional space and what the different communities want. And often it's a cultural thing. So some of you will have palm trees. I mean, I'm personally not a big fan of palm trees because they don't really do much environmentally, but they're incredibly important culturally, and they were brought out as ornamentals in the 19th and early 20th century. So we've got cultural trees, and in fact, oak, ash, elm, Moreton Bay figs are actually cultural trees. Well, don't get me started on olives. I mean, and olives are really odd because they were actually introduced and planted here to provide light oils, not as a food. They only became a food item really after the migrations after the Second World War. So they had a really interesting specific purpose, and we have a number of really historic olive groves scattered around the place, but they have created a significant problem as well. So managing that. So what we don't have is a really good understanding about what green means. And so much of the work now is firstly understanding the legal aspects, the social requirements, and then the biology and the ecology of the plants and the ecosystems that we have here, which is why Stefan's work, Tom's, and actually quite a number here, Bob Hill, I don't know if he's here, there's quite a number of people working in this space to really come to grips with, well, firstly, what have we got? Secondly, why do we have it? Thirdly, what does it mean for the various animals that come to share the space? Because again, we get perverse outcomes with animals too. We've tended to retain some great big beautiful eucalypts in some spots around ovals. Well, the bird that loves that is the corella. And so we wind up with 20 to 50,000 corellas moving in. We're not chopping the trees down because the corellas are buggers under no circumstance. But we have another significant management problem there as well. So it's about sorting all this through and deciding, okay, how do we improve the quality of the green space? How do we identify the significantly endangered species that are actually belong on the Adelaide Plains and in the Mount Lofties? And then how do we make the best out of improving the situation? And that's really what Green Adelaide's all about. So we currently invest $1 million a year through grassroots grants, and many of you have got those for around those plantings. We're working with local government to also understand what they want. Often the really important parts of government here are the local government because they know their own community. And they're the ones that often bear the brunt of the significant tree loss. So there are just a few kind of random thoughts about the challenges that we face. It's really difficult. And Green Adelaide is in the process of developing an urban greening strategy, about 2/3 the way through it, and it'll come to you for comment. That we will be putting into or pushing to put into both the review of the planning code and also the 30-year plan. So all of you will get a chance to really comment and drive that as hard as we possibly can. So there's a lot of opportunity here now to actually develop our understanding and make a real difference. Tom, did you want to? No, Tom doesn't.
Thank you, Chris. Now we'll touch on this one. Will the Native Vegetation Act and regulations be reviewed as many trees and native vegetation are being approved for removal under this Act?
Well, that act's under the Deputy Premier and the Minister for Environment. I don't believe it's going to be reviewed, but I might take that on notice and get back to you.
Yeah.
As part of the planning review, which is on at the moment, the discussion paper, which Stefan mentioned before, has touched a little bit in that area, but it's yet to be seen sort of as to how those recommendations will end up sort of interacting with this whole area. And certainly the reports which we've done from the Conservation Council perspective have touched on those because a lot of metropolitan Adelaide overlaps with the native vegetation protections. So even parts, for example, of Wattle Park have the native vegetation protection. Yeah, there, perfect. So yeah, just quickly, the discussion paper has had a little bit of look at the native veg review, but as to how much that gets carried over into the recommendations is yet to be seen. Personally, I think that they will need to be looked at in conjunction because, as was highlighted before, there are so many different acts and so many different areas which touch on trees, and if you start touching one, you've got to have a holistic approach to actually get better outcomes that work for everybody.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, which of the 10 tree protection recommendations for SA law reform do you as the Minister support?
Well, this is a period of community consultation. It's a period of review. You're all providing your feedback. Now, in other areas where we've got reviews, I've said, like the 30-year plan and a range of other things, I've said, well, I'm not going to comment preempting the review before it's all done and dusted. So at an appropriate time, the government will respond and you'll be able to see that in time and react to it in time. And obviously, we've given an election commitment and we intend to complete, to complete that election commitment, to meet it. And then, obviously, as part of that, we'll be making decisions over the next 4 years.
Like, quite frankly, that's a cop-out. That was my question. And you must be able to say something rather than say nothing. It is not preempting to say which ones you support or which ones appear sensible or which ones have merit. So if you need to take 5 minutes, we will wait.
Look, I don't mind you giving me, your feedback, but you've got to understand that there's a process of government. I know that's not very, it's not what you want to hear. I get that, but there is a process of government. And the process is we do a review and then there's a period of internal deliberation because that's what happens with cabinets. That's what happens with cabinet governments. Ministers just don't get up and say things willy-nilly. We do things in a considered fashion because that leads to better outcomes, frankly. It's not a perfect process, but it's a better process than people making things up on the run. And I'm not going to make things up on a run. So if you don't like it, that's fine, and I've heard your feedback, but I'm going to keep to what is a coherent way of making public policy, which is to have a review, to have an election commitment, which you all know, to have a review, which I shouldn't preempt and won't preempt, to get all of your feedback, because there's plenty of people who are not in this room who also deserve their right to have feedback, and then to make public policy in a proper way, which in a considered way, which is by taking it to Cabinet and for other ministers to have their say, and for us to then take it to the Parliament, if that's appropriate, or to regulate, if that's appropriate.
We all want to make sure you stick with your commitments.
I'm sure.
Why can't councils reward residents who retain trees? I should also say, it hasn't come up, but, properties with trees are worth more, right? There's all sorts of... Okay, do you want to respond to that?
So, kinda, sorta. A property with a house with trees on it has a high amenity value, and it is definitely going to attract a higher price as a result. However, you can probably get more money by bulldozing everything, subdividing that nice garden into 2 or 3 lots, and building some smaller houses, lower building standards, no trees. You will make more money 9 times out of 10 doing that, if the block is big enough to subdivide.
There are also some councils who are trialling a whole lot of kind of innovative thinking around this space. So there's some who want to actually have reduced rates if you have more than 15% cover. I know there's a couple kicking around about the idea of having developers put money into a fund. So if you have a street where there's a lot of division and you're getting one house turned into 4, well, there should be money to buy up properties that could be turned into the pocket parks for kids or for having some green open space, because you're going to be losing those. We also need to be putting a lot of pressure on commercial and industrial developments. There's a lot of big car parks out there that don't have trees in them, and that's just crazy. We are not, we tend to let a lot of commercial off the hook by not having green walls, green roofs, water-sensitive urban design. There's a lot of opportunities there. If you look at the roofs in the city, there's very few green ones. So I think we also need to be value adding. Yes, it is about protecting really important trees and environments, and also doing many of these other kind of innovative things.
Stefan, do you want to add to that or no? Tom? No? Okay. Now, I guess this is what we're all here because we're passionate about this. When can we expect an outcome from this process?
Well, the expert panel reports next year, early next year, and then the 30-year plan, the regional plans are on at the moment, and then the Adelaide plan will begin and finish the year after. So in that period, obviously, we'll be getting some advice back, advice on these reports and other things, and then we'll be responding over that period.
How about all the improvements and facilities in there?
What year was that?
Well, there's the expert panel reports early next year, so that'll be the first period. The State Planning Commission's already doing.
What do we do now?
Too slow now.
We don't give a couple of years. What do you start tomorrow?
Well, do you want me to answer, or do you want to just? I'm happy to get your feedback. If people want to come here and.
I'm just not sure what you want from me here.
They've got a system. You can provide your feedback. I'm happy to hear your feedback. I came here because I wanted to have the interaction, but I get people are frustrated, and you know, I understand the passion, I understand the emotion, but we've given an election commitment. We're committed to fulfilling all of our election commitments. We're going through a process on the best way to do that. That's the best way you get good public policy, to actually listen to people, have long periods of examination of these things so you can get the right outcome. Because you're all telling me that the current outcome, the status quo, isn't good enough. So you only get one shot at reform. So you either do it in a coherent fashion, you build support, you build sort of social licence, you bring the community along with you, because I know everybody in this room is really passionate, but there's a world of people out there as well, and you have to bring them along with you.
Okay. So this one, why have other states been able to do it, but we lag behind again?
Well, I think other states obviously didn't have the changes that were done in 2011, and they've got a range of different responses. One of the reasons when we came to government in opposition, the now Deputy Premier made a commitment to examine our laws against all the other states, to benchmark them, and then to make some policy responses to bring them up to grade. So that's the process we're going through at the moment.
So you might just add a little bit into that. I think it's really key to come back to, once again, the fact that South Australia here, the tree laws are set by the state government. And I think the Minister here tonight has sort of run people through the process in terms of getting change, whether we like it or not, and that's a bit irrelevant. That's sort of how things work. When the protections of vegetation and trees interstate are set by councils, those protections are set to meet the expectations of local communities. And from a local government level, they can move a lot quicker than what state governments can do, and have to bring the whole state on board with them to try and get changes in that area. And I think that's one of the really key differences here, in terms of if you've got to bring everybody together with you, it is a much more slower process, rather than councils who can consult with their own little communities, have much varying different community expectations between, for example, what Mitcham and other areas have. And I think that's why there are some quicker outcomes interstate than what we've had here. And even since, for example, the comparison report's been done by the Conservation Council or the University of Adelaide, a lot of those councils have already changed the laws that they have in regards to trees already. So there is a tremendous amount of catch-up in this space.
Okay. Will you halt tree clearance while the reviews are being developed? In previous states, clearing accelerated during review periods in anticipation of law change.
Well, I don't know if I have the legal capacity to do that. I'd have to. Well, but ministers aren't invested. It's a legislation that governs these things and the code that governs these things. So I don't. I guess the answer to that is no. I don't want to mislead you. But to be honest, that's not something that's been put to me before tonight.
Sorry. My organisation, Self Woodlands and Wetlands Action Network, has written to you 3 times asking for you to pause development while this review is underway. To say that you have been asked is just not simply true, mate. I'm sorry.
Yes. A quick one?
Yes. This is not about passion. This is about science. I think you can hear me. This is not about passion, it's about science. There's passion on both sides because there are developers or anyone else you like who can say, no, we want to moderate things and we don't want to have any desperate measures. However, the planet needs desperate measures and we are in a climate crisis. And that's what it's about. It's about the science. Lots of the information that was presented at the beginning of this talk was in a very scientific form. And it is science that we should be listening to and taking note of, because that is what is going to protect us from the carbon crisis. And a tree is a tree and a magnificent sequester of carbon.
Well said. Will you as the Minister support changing the 3-metre circumference to 1.5 to be consistent with other states and effectively prevent clear felling infill development sites?
Well, I might take Sandy's question as a recommendation, perhaps. Look, I don't want to. It's a bit of a difficult position for me because I genuinely don't want to preempt the review, and I don't want to preempt community consultation. These reports have been put out there in the public domain by me, so all of you can comment on them, and so all of you can make recommendations to the review, and so that people can, have their say. So I don't want to be preempting it by me standing up here and making a whole lot of universal declarations just to get applause, right? I appreciate that might be more pleasant for all of us than me saying to you, well, I'm listening to you, but I'm not going to give you a running commentary on what I'm going to sign up to or what I'm not, because that's not the role of a minister in a cabinet government. Basically, we have the review, it then gets taken to cabinet, we then announce the decisions.
Okay, now we'll put this one in and maybe we'll even get Chris to chip in on this one. How do we balance more compact infill development with more trees and green space with urban sprawl?
Oh, you give me the really easy questions then. Thank you. Thank you, Sophie. Look, yeah, I mean, that's the great conundrum. We know things are developing at pace here, and we have housing crises and all these various things that you know as well as I. So we have to think of a range of solutions. It isn't one size fits all. So on the first stage, yes, we need to identify those trees that are incredibly important. I noticed, Uncle Tamaroo, someone had a question up about how we bring back the red-tailed black cockatoo or the glossy blacks. And they feed on drooping she oak. They've been planting them. They take 30 years to grow, but they have now been planted at Fishery Beach, and those cockatoos are back for the first time in almost 100 years. So you can do it. You can do it by firstly knowing the really good science. They were drooping she oak, so they feed only on those. And they flew across from Kangaroo Island. My point about those is that we need a variety of different plants to support a variety of different animals, and we need to do a variety of different things. So much of our future is going to be around relating biodiversity-sensitive urban design and water-sensitive urban design. So planting green walls, green roofs, cycling the water that we have through, using Indigenous plants, using the right plants in the right place, and using the space that we do have We struggle for space because of the strange way that Adelaide has developed really since 1836. And we have been different to the other cities. One, because all the other ones, with the exception of Melbourne really, had ravines and gorges and hills that acted as refuges for a lot of remnant vegetation. Well, we sort of hit the Adelaide Plains like a plague of locusts and cleared it all away for farms and become really productive. So we didn't leave very much. And then, as we've heard, as Stefan was saying, we developed across the farms and it went from nothing then to suburbs, and some of those were gradually planted up by people like August Peltzer after, and Sophie has just won the Peltzer Prize for greening up the city because of his extraordinary work. So we need to do lots of these different things. We need to be using the little bits of space that we do have. Median strips are incredibly important. The bits outside of the front can all be developed. And they don't actually develop with planting up, both for green aspects, but also there are those who use them for putting in fruit trees and a range of community gardens. Look, if you're walking home, walk past North Street. There's a beautiful little community garden on one housing block tucked away on North Street, right in the middle of the city. We could have one or two of those on every street. Then you start making a huge difference. So it's about using those vacant blocks, those spaces, those pocket parks, and they can be incredibly valuable. We should have a target across the city, a minimum of 30% in my view. That's my personal bias. But then obviously there are places like Mitcham that need to have a lot more than that. Dr. Holmes-Ross has nodded in furious agreement here. And that we also then can get away from the social inequities we have with having some areas with less than 10% and others with upwards of 50%. So yeah, lots of things to do and lots of things that can be done by individuals, by small groups, by streets, by community members, as well as by local government and state government. So it's actually about partnerships. And one of the things Green Adelaide, through the National Park City Initiative, is really promoting partnerships, because that's the only way we're going to get sufficient investment and sufficient buy-in. And those partnerships are also really important for education. You know, we have all sorts of people arriving in Adelaide from all sorts of places, many of which do not have trees. I mean, they come from cities and communities all around the world that have been devoid of trees for generations. So their baseline is much, much lower than ours. So we have to also make sure that everybody in the community realises how important green space is. And that was alluded to by Minister Chapman a moment ago, is that we have this major group in our community who are not you, who are not me, and who don't get it, that trees are important. There are some local government areas where there are thousands of requests a month to chop down trees because they're dropping leaves and they're too much work to clean up. And then there are other nearby local governments where people chain themselves to the trees if you even look at them sideways. So how can we have this variation in one city in the way people view and appreciate our trees? So I've got a lot of work to do in terms of the education of our community, of the new and newer South Australians, and those in different regions where there isn't as an equal appreciation of trees. So, a lot of work, and it's going to take quite a while, but as someone once said, we should have started yesterday, we should have started the day before yesterday, but we can always start now.
Okay, we're going to take 3 more questions. Do you agree that all new developments should be designed around existing trees?
Well, let's see what the review says. Let's see what the reports say. I know, well, but like, you got to understand, right? I can't preempt reviews. I can take your feedback, and from the tenor of your questions, I understand your passion. Very useful. All the questions can come to my office, and I'll refer them on to the expert committee. Happy to do that, and happy to come back here once it's all concluded, and we can have another conversation.
So there are going to be reams of questions we don't even get to. So we're going to make sure that they get passed on to Craig and Joanna, and they will get sent through to the Minister. And conservation, so you will be kept in the loop after this. Will the Open Space Fund be reimbursed after it was plundered to pay for the code?
Now, I think this is referring to the actions of the previous government, because the code was put in by the previous government. So what happens is the fund gets replenished every year. I mean, I guess I can't. It will be replenished, but as to I can't sort of make amends for the actions of a previous government.
Last question that someone else might be able to answer. Someone referred to the Resilient South planning. Are trees currently being economically included as assets in our forward planning under the Resilient Regional programs?
Okay. Are trees being included? Thank you, Stefan.
I don't think this is really connected to the resilient regions, but trees on public land are not viewed as assets. They're not viewed in asset management frameworks, but there is interest in doing so. So there are various methodologies for valuing trees. You can go out and you can fill in a process that pumps out a dollar value, and certainly a lot of councils are looking at that for valuing their urban forests. There's also, that process can be used to value trees on private land, which might be used to identify what kind of offset might be payable in some circumstances. So it's definitely something that both public and private organisations are looking at, but it's not part of the framework at the moment.
Thank you, Stefan. And the last one we're going to do, can the Minister consider any minor interim actions ahead of a formal reform? Communicating with councils via email with recommendations could be a good start.
Well, of course, I might consider things in advance, and I might make recommendations, just as we did with the grey box trees down in Jane's electorate. So we are doing things. I don't want people to think that we don't take action where we see opportunities. Of course we do. But it's just, and I understand the mood of the room is for immediate action and that you're frustrated at what's been going on for the better part of a decade. But you do have to, I suppose, acknowledge that I can't click my fingers and create legislative or regulatory reform overnight. Okay. Now, we have a special gift for you. It's not the bottle of red you were looking forward to. No, I think some people are probably going to give me a piece of their mind after the meeting, I see.
Okay, so are you going to click the slide? There we are. Okay, so you might have noticed that the guys ushering you in this morning, this evening, have got a T-shirt which says, "I'm a tree champion." You can order those T-shirts. There is an order form, old school, out in the foyer, and you can pay for it. Now, we will just point out that the Minister gets his own. So it says, "You're the tree champion."
Good.
So, okay.
All right, good. I like it.
Thank you, Minister.
Thanks.
Okay.
I live in the western suburbs, and I'm very close to where the Crows want to actually take over what they call the 70 Oval precinct. That's the Oval, just the Oval. They want to take over the King's Reserve. We've estimated that over 150 trees will have to be removed to cater to an MCG-sized oval and an Adelaide oval development. We lose access to the only piece of green space that we have locally to our community, and we have been kept in the dark for the last 2 years. And this is going to happen and keep on happening while banks move their reform process. This is the here and now, and we're very, very concerned locally about what's happening to us as you've experienced and witnessed as everybody is. And I think everybody needs to be aware of that. I mean, everybody is aware of that. That's why they're here. But I'm very, very distressed. to be put off on these and not be able to recognise what we're all clamouring for is really, really disheartening for a Labor government that all of us voted for, most people did, because they were listening to the community. Listen now.
We all go away from here wanting change, and we need to stay connected, and we need to keep fighting for it and make sure that change comes as a result of this. We need to thank all the speakers. We need to thank the organising groups, Conservation Council of South Australia, National Trust, Trees for Life, Australian Institute of Landscape Architects, TreeNet, the Nature Conservation Society of South Australia, and the many other wonderful volunteer and community campaigners and advocates. Please make sure that you jump on the screen above, write down the details there, and contact your elected members and other decision makers to let them know how much you love trees and want them protected. So if we keep causing trouble, sorry? And vote in local elections, absolutely. Yeah. So we're in this amazing age of communication, right? And messages get out there very quickly now. So make sure that you stay connected and support organisations like the organisations that are put tonight on, and they will keep you updated. And then if we all individually put pressure on people, we can make a change. Thank you.
And please thank the wonderful Sophie for the night.